The first time Clara noticed them, the two men were just dark silhouettes against the fiery sunset, their eyes fixed on her like predators sizing up prey. The desert stretched endlessly, a scarlet canvas of dust and rock, with the sun hanging low, bleeding gold and crimson across the sky. Her horse, a chestnut mare named Daisy, picked its way carefully over the cracked, arid trail, hooves clattering like a warning drumbeat against the parched earth. Clara, 30 years old, with sun-leathered skin and sharp green eyes that had learned to read danger, felt her chest tighten with a familiar pulse of unease. She knew she was being followed. She had seen this before, men who thought themselves clever, who believed they could stalk a lone woman through the canyons and deserts without consequence. But there was something different about these two. Their movements were too precise, too deliberate. They didn't merely trail her. They mirrored her pace, anticipating her turns and pauses, as though they had memorized the desert itself. Clara's fingers tightened around the reins, and she felt a bead of sweat trickle down her temple despite the dry heat. The wind carried the tang of sagebrush and sun-baked clay, mingling with the faint smell of smoke from a distant campfire. She glanced back, trying to see their faces, but the setting sun made them shadows, faceless and menacing. Her pulse thudded louder, echoing in her ears. Each step Daisy took brought her closer to the narrow pass ahead, a place she had crossed countless times. But tonight it felt like a trap. Suddenly, movement in the dust off the trail caught her eye. A figure emerged from the canyon wall, stepping silently over the cracked stones. At first, she thought it was another of the men, but then the sunlight hit him and her breath caught. He was a towering man, shirtless, his bronzed skin shining in the dying light. Muscles rippled beneath taut skin, honed from years of life in the harsh desert. Long black hair fell past his broad shoulders, swaying slightly with the wind. Bones, beads, and silver jewelry adorned his chest and arms, glinting faintly in the sun. A spear rested loosely in his hand, yet the aura around him made it clear he didn't need it to command attention. The two men on the trail froze, sensing him before they fully saw him. Their confident strides faltered, eyes widening as though they had suddenly realized the desert itself had risen against them. Clara blinked, startled. She had never seen anyone move through the desert like that, like a shadow and a storm combined. Her heart raced, a mixture of relief and renewed tension. The warrior's gaze swept across the canyon, finally resting on her. In that instant, a silent understanding passed between them. He was here to protect, but the desert could be unforgiving, and nothing was guaranteed. Clara's mind raced. Who was he? How had he appeared so suddenly, so precisely? And most importantly, could she trust him? The two men exchanged a glance, their bravado slipping. One of them stepped forward, a twisted grin tugging at his weathered face. "Well, well," he sneered, "looks like we've got company." "Who's this?" The warrior didn't answer. He merely took a slow step forward, his bare feet kicking up dust, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine despite the desert heat. There was power in his stillness, authority in the way he held himself. The men hesitated, calculating whether to retreat or attack, their confidence unraveling under the weight of his gaze. Clara urged Daisy forward, trying to regain her composure, but the narrow trail limited her options. She glanced again at the warrior, who now stood like a sentinel between her and the shadows of danger. His presence radiated calm strength, and for the first time since she had sensed the men following her, she felt a flicker of hope dot the desert. Wind shifted, swirling sand around them, carrying the scent of sage and distant smoke. The horizon glowed with a dying sun, painting the canyon walls in fiery gold and deep crimson shadows. In the midst of this unforgiving land, Clara realized one thing with crystal clarity. Tonight, she was no longer alone, and whatever this warrior's story was, it had just collided with hers in the most unexpected, dangerous, and possibly life-saving way. The chase had begun, but now the rules had changed. Clara's lungs burned as she urged Daisy forward, hooves striking sparks of dry dust that rose and swirled around them. The canyon walls seemed to close in, jagged rock faces painted in the deep reds and golds of the setting sun. Behind her, the two men followed relentlessly, their grins cruel and calculating, faces shadowed and weathered by years of hardship and violence. Each time Clara glanced back, the fear in their eyes sharpened her own instincts. These were no ordinary pursuers. They had patience, and patience in the desert often meant deadly intent. The warrior moved like a phantom through the canyon. One moment he was behind the women, another he appeared ahead, as if the desert itself carried him on the wind. His bronze chest gleamed under the fading sun, muscles coiling and flexing with every step. Bones and beads on his arms and chest rattled softly with each movement, giving a faint, almost musical counterpoint to the rhythmic pounding of hooves on stone. His spear was held loosely in one hand, yet it seemed an extension of his very presence. Clara's fear had not yet transformed into trust, but she felt a thread of hope stretch taut across her chest. The two men exchanged a glance, their bravado slipping like sand through fingers. "She's not going anywhere, Jack," muttered one, his voice low, coarse. "We'll have her before nightfall." Jack's face twisted into a snarl, but when his gaze flicked upward, he froze. The warrior stood atop a rocky ledge, arms crossed, long black hair flowing behind him like a dark banner in the wind. The sun caught the silver and bone on his chest, making him gleam like some avenging spirit. The men's steps faltered, uncertainty creeping into their movement. They were predators, yes, but suddenly they sensed they were being watched by a force older, faster, and stronger than themselves. Clara's heart raced as Daisy skidded on a patch of loose stone. The two men were gaining ground, their shadows stretching long across the canyon floor. Panic threatened to claw its way into her chest, but the warrior's presence steadied her just enough to think clearly. He moved with the precision of a piazza hawk, muscles coiling and releasing, every motion deliberate. The desert wind whipped up a cloud of red dust that shrouded him in mystery. Clara had never seen a human move like that, not even in the legends told in hushed tones around campfires. A sudden shout from one of the men startled Daisy, and she reared, tossing Clara against the saddle. Heart hammering, Clara twisted in. The saddle, meeting the warrior's gaze. His dark eyes were steady, unwavering, a silent promise that he would not let harm come to her. She felt the pull of courage in his presence, raw and undeniable, like the pull of the desert itself. Men lunged, but the warrior's intervention was instantaneous. With a blur of motion, he leapt from a ledge, landing between Clara and her pursuers. Sand erupted under his bare feet. The spear he held moved almost on its own, deflecting one man's knife with a sharp metallic clang. Clara's pulse raced. As she watched the deadly precision of his strikes, each movement choreographed like a violent dance. The second man hesitated, horror and disbelief etched across his face. "Get back." The warrior's voice rang out, a low, commanding growl that reverberated across the canyon walls. His muscles tensed, eyes narrowed, as the sun painted the canyon in dramatic streaks of firelight and shadow. Clara realized then that this man was no mere fighter. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the desert's fierce, unyielding power. The men scrambled backward, their confidence shattered. One stumbled over a loose rock, catching himself with a growl, while the other's knife clattered uselessly against the canyon wall. Clara leaned close to Daisy, breathing hard, trying to steady both horse and herself. For the first time, she understood the full measure of the warrior's presence. He was not just protecting her. He was rewriting the rules of the chase entirely. Sand and wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of sage and dry stone. The canyon seemed alive, echoing with the thundering of hooves, the shouts of the men, and the almost supernatural grace of the warrior. Clara's chest heaved with adrenaline and awe. She couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly, but she didn't need words. She knew this stranger had entered her life for a reason. The chase had intensified, but with him there, for the first time in days, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The sun sank lower, shadows stretching and darkening the canyon. Clara spurred Daisy onward, the warrior keeping pace effortlessly. At her side. Behind them, the two men regrouped, fear replacing arrogance. They were hunters turned hunted, and Clara realized the night ahead would be full of danger, but now, for the first time, she was not alone. The desert was vast, unyielding, and dangerous, but together they would navigate its perilous heart. The canyon narrowed to a jagged corridor, cliffs rising like the walls of a fortress, casting long, dark shadows across the red-dusted trail. Clara's chest heaved, and Daisy's flanks glistened with sweat as the horse's hooves skidded over loose stones. The two men had gained ground, their silhouettes growing larger, faces twisted with malicious intent. Clara's fingers gripped the reins so tightly her knuckles whitened. Every instinct screamed danger, yet behind her, the warrior moved with an almost unnatural grace, a silent shadow over the rocks. Then it happened. One of the men lunged forward, knife flashing in the dying sunlight. Clara froze, terror rooting her in the saddle, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow to the glint of steel and the pounding of her heart. But the warrior was already there, as if he had anticipated the attack. With a fluid motion, he thrust his spear forward, deflecting the knife with a metallic clang. Sand erupted around them, kicked up by the warrior's bare feet as he pivoted with lethal precision. The second man hesitated, a flicker of fear crossing his rugged face. He had been confident, sure of himself, but now he realized he had underestimated this figure. The warrior's muscles coiled and released with the ease of a predator, every movement measured, controlled, perfect. His long black hair whipped in the wind, beads and bones on his chest rattling softly, a subtle percussion to the storm of motion. Clara, heart still hammering, realized she had never seen anything like it. This was no ordinary man. This was a force of nature incarnate in flesh and bone. The first man scrambled backward, clutching his arm where the spear had grazed him. Blood darkened the sun-baked dust, stark against the red rocks. The second man swung his knife desperately, but the warrior sidestepped effortlessly, landing a precise strike to the man's shoulder with the shaft of his spear. Pain and shock rippled across the man's face as he tumbled to the ground, knife clattering uselessly. Clara exhaled shakily, gripping Daisy's mane. For the first time since the chase began, she felt a flicker of safety. She dared to glance at the warrior, who now stood between her and the canyon walls, chest rising and falling in measured breaths. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned the canyon with the sharpness of a hawk. Though his expression remained calm, Clara could feel the intensity radiating off him like heat from a summer rock face. The wind swept through the canyon, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the iron tang of blood. Dust danced in the golden light, swirling around the three figures like ghostly spectators to the confrontation. Clara's pulse slowed slightly, but adrenaline still coursed through her veins. She realized the warrior wasn't just protecting her, he was asserting dominion over the desert itself, reshaping the battlefield with every movement. The second man groaned, pushing himself up on trembling arms. "This isn't over," he spat, rage and fear warring in his eyes. But even as he spoke, his steps faltered. The canyon walls seemed to press in, the shadows of the rocks stretching like silent witnesses to his defeat. The warrior didn't flinch. He planted his spear firmly in the sand, a silent warning that resistance was futile. Clara's voice trembled as she whispered, almost to herself, Who are you?" The warrior's gaze softened for just a moment as he glanced at her. "Someone who has learned the desert has only one rule: survive or be buried by it," he said, voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of countless battles fought under scorching sun and unforgiving skies. Clara didn't understand fully, but she sensed the truth in his words. He had lived by these rules, and now, by some mysterious fate, he had chosen to stand between her and certain harm. The canyon fell silent except for the wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Clara felt her chest swell with a mixture of relief and awe. She had been running from danger for so long that she had almost forgotten what hope felt like. Now, with this warrior standing guard, she realized that perhaps survival was possible. Perhaps the desert, harsh and unyielding as it was, could also yield moments of protection and courage as the sun dipped lower, spilling firelight across the jagged rocks. Clara guided Daisy to the side, keeping her distance from the defeated men. The warrior remained alert, spear in hand, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. In that moment, Clara understood that the chase had changed. She was no longer simply fleeing. She had an ally, a shield forged in muscle, skill, and something deeper, a bond born from necessity and danger. The desert whispered around them, the red dust settling like a quiet witness to the first stand. And Clara knew, deep in her bones, that whatever came next, she would face it with this warrior by her side. Night descended over the canyon like a heavy cloak, swallowing the last streaks of crimson light until only the stars glittered above. The desert transformed under darkness. Where once it had been a furnace of heat and dust, now it breathed cool air laced with the scent of sage and distant rain. Clara sat close to the crackling fire, its orange glow painting her face in shifting shadows. The flames snapped and hissed as if impatient to speak the truths the night demanded. Daisy grazed quietly nearby, her flanks still damp with sweat from the chase. The two men lay bound against a rock, their wrists tied tight with strips of leather. The warrior had cut from his own gear. Their eyes glared with malice through the flickering firelight, but they made no sound. Clara suspected it wasn't courage that kept them quiet, but the watchful presence of the warrior sitting across the fire, his dark eyes unblinking, his spear resting easily at his side. Clara studied him carefully. In the glow of the fire, his bronze skin seemed carved from stone, muscles rippling as he shifted. His long black hair shimmered with a blue sheen in the starlight, strands moving gently with the night breeze. The tribal jewelry he wore, beads, bones, and small pieces of silver caught the fire's glow, casting tiny sparks of reflected light. He was unlike anyone she had ever seen, not just in appearance but in the aura he carried. The canyon seemed to bend around him, as though even the night respected his presence. At last, Clara broke the silence. Her voice came out softer than she expected, tinged with weariness. "Why are they following me?" She nodded toward the two men who smirked faintly in the firelight. "I don't even know them. I've done nothing to deserve this." The warrior did not answer immediately. He leaned forward, lifting a small stick and prodding the embers, sending a swirl of sparks into the night sky. His voice, when it came, was deep and measured, carrying the weight of someone used to speaking only when necessary. "Some debts are older than the land itself," he said, "and sometimes, without knowing it, we carry those debts in our blood or in the things we hold." Clara frowned, her brow furrowing. "What does that mean?" The warrior's gaze shifted, settling on her with an intensity that sent a shiver through her despite the fire's warmth. "Those men are not after you for who you are," he said slowly. "They are after what you carry, something you may not even realize you possess." Clara's hands instinctively went to the leather satchel slung across her shoulder. She opened it, pulling out a worn ledger bound in cracked brown leather. "This?" she asked, bewildered. "It belonged to my late father. Just old notes. And maps, nothing more." The warrior's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Clara thought she saw something like recognition in his expression. He reached forward, not to take the book, but to study it in the firelight. The pages fluttered in the wind, revealing lines of faded ink names, numbers, and land plots scribbled in a neat hand. "That," the warrior said, his voice low, "is not just a book. It is a record. A record of stolen lands, of broken promises, of men who grew rich while others were cast into dust." His gaze flicked toward the two bound men, who now shifted uneasily, their smirks gone. "It is worth more than gold to some, and worth your life to others." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had always thought her father's wanderings and notes were little more than the eccentricities of a man too curious for his own good. But now, staring at the ledger, she realized its pages were heavy with secrets. Secrets powerful men would kill to keep buried. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward like fleeting stars. Clara felt the weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her shoulders. "So that's why," she whispered. "That's why they won't stop." The warrior nodded once. His eyes softened just slightly, though his posture remained rigid, protective. "They will not stop until the book is destroyed or in hands strong enough to use it for justice." Clara looked at him across the fire, her heart pounding not with fear this time, but with the dawning realization that her life was no longer her own. She was tangled in a fight older and larger than she had ever imagined. The desert night grew colder, and the cries of distant coyotes echoed through the canyon. The two men shifted in their bonds, but the warrior's steady gaze silenced them again. Clara hugged the ledger to her chest, her mind a storm of questions and fears. Yet one truth cut through the noise. She could not face this alone, and for reasons she could not explain, she believed this warrior, this silent, unyielding guardian, would not let her. The flames roared higher for a moment, as though sealing a pact in their glow. The desert night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional hiss of the campfire and the faint calls of distant coyotes. The canyon walls framed the campsite like dark sentinels, holding in the heat of the day but offering no comfort. Clara sat with her knees drawn close to her chest, staring at the battered ledger in her lap. The crackle of the fire cast shifting shapes across her pale face, highlighting the worry in her eyes. She knew the book she carried was worth more than gold, worth enough to drive men to kill or worse. Across from her, the native warrior remained still, his dark eyes fixed on the two bound men against the boulder. Shirtless, his bronzed skin reflected the fire's glow. Every scar along his chest and arm speaking of battle survived. His long black hair caught the occasional desert breeze, moving like silk shadows. Beads, bone, and silver gleamed against his skin, shimmering in the firelight. He was a figure pulled from legend, calm, unshaken, as though he could hear the desert breathing itself. The two men, Jed and Amos, shifted uncomfortably in their restraints. Their eyes darted between each other, then back toward Clara. Anger simmered in their faces, but beneath that anger Clara recognized something else. Desperation. "You don't know what you're holding, lady," Jed finally muttered, his voice hoarse. The firelight showed the deep creases in his weathered face. "That ledger ain't yours. Best you hand it over before this goes any further." Clara didn't reply. Her hand tightened around the leather-bound book as though it were part of her. The warrior's gaze moved from the men to Clara, then back again. He didn't speak, but his silence carried its own authority. As if words weren't needed to enforce order. Amos, the heavier of the two, leaned forward, his ropes creaking against the rock. "You think he'll protect you forever?" "He ain't. Your kin," He'll walk away when the coyotes come close enough. Hand it over to us, and maybe we let you live." Clara's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. She thought of her father's voice, the night he whispered in her ear before being taken, "Don't let it fall into their hands. Not ever." The warriors stirred then, his deep voice breaking the silence. Quiet. The command was simple, yet it silenced the canyon. Even the coyotes seemed to pause. Jed and Amos fell back against the rock, their faces hard, but words gone. Clara felt a shiver not of fear, but of something else. For the first time in days, she felt the strange weight of safety. But safety in the desert was always an illusion. Hours passed. The fire burned low, embers glowing red against the cool sand. Clara's head nodded as fatigue pulled at her, but she resisted sleep. She sensed danger lingered too close. The warrior had not moved, sitting as still as the cliffs themselves, eyes reflecting the dying flames. Then, in the dead of night, Clara heard it, a faint scrape. Her eyes snapped open. Across the fire she saw Amos twisting, his thick wrists working against the rope. Jed leaned subtly, shielding him from the warrior's view. They thought she slept. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She looked to the warrior, but his eyes were closed, as though meditating or listening. She couldn't tell. Another scrape, louder now. The rope gave. Amos's wrist slipped free. His hand shot to his boot, retrieving a knife he'd hidden even while tied. His eyes gleamed with triumph. Clara gasped before she could stop herself. Yet's head whipped toward her, his teeth bared like a wolf. Quiet, girl, but the damage was done. The warrior's eyes snapped open. In one smooth motion he rose, spear in hand, his shadow stretching tall across the canyon wall. Amos lunged. Across the fire, blade flashing. Jed scrambled, trying to shake his ropes free. Clara stumbled back, clutching the ledger to her chest. The firelight exploded into chaos, shadows leaping, sparks flying, the warrior moving with sudden ferocity. The spear shaft struck Amos's wrist with a crack, sending the knife spinning into the sand. The warrior pivoted, the beads and bones across his chest rattling softly as he pressed Amos to the ground with one powerful arm. Jed shouted, tearing at his ropes. He managed to wrench himself free and charged, a second knife glinting in his hand. Clara screamed. The warrior turned just in time. Yet's blade cut a shallow line across his shoulder, but the warrior didn't flinch. With a roar that seemed to echo from the canyon itself, he slammed the spear's butt into Yet's chest, knocking the wind out of him. The fight was quick, brutal, and final. Within moments, both men were back in the dirt, groaning, defeated. Their knives lay scattered in the sand. The warrior stood over them, chest heaving, blood from the shallow cut trailing down his arm. His hair, black as raven wings, shimmered with firelight, and his eyes burned with a warning older than any law. Clara clutched the ledger tight, heart pounding. She realized then it wasn't just the book they were after. It was something far bigger, something worth spilling blood for. And she had just been pulled into the center of it. The canyon fell into silence after the clash, as if even the desert itself held its breath. The embers of the dying fire gave off a faint glow, and the young woman stood clutching the ledger like a lifeline. Her hands trembled, not only from what had just happened, but from the way the warrior now stood apart from her, motionless, framed in silver moonlight, his spear still dripping with the shadows of violence. He was not just a man of flesh and strength. Something about him carried an echo of ages, an old grief that pressed against the night air like thunder waiting to break. The woman dared to speak, her voice shaky but steadying with each word. "You saved me again, but why? Who are you?" The warrior did not answer immediately. He crouched by the stream running through the canyon, washed his hands, then let the cold water trickle through his fingers as though purging more than blood. Finally, he lifted his gaze to her. His voice, when it came, was deep and steady, but carried a sorrow that rooted her where she stood. "My name is Tahu." The syllables carried weight, reverberating off the stone walls. "Once," he continued, "I lived not far from here, where the river bends toward the open plains. I had a wife, a son." His eyes flickered, and for a moment the hardened mask of a warrior gave way to something raw, something fragile. "They were taken. Men much like those you saw, traders, fenders of flesh. They burned my home to the ground and left me with nothing but ash." The woman pressed the ledger to her chest. The wind stirred, tugging at her hair, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and smoke. She felt the sting of his words like a blade drawn slow across her heart. What happened to them?" she whispered. Tahu's jaw tightened. "I searched for months, traveled beyond rivers and mountains. I found bones, charred and broken, left behind in the dirt. I buried what I could. The earth holds the rest." Silence swallowed them. The woman felt her knees weaken, but she stayed standing, unable to turn away from the storm in his eyes. This was not just a man who saved her. This was a man who had bled grief into the desert until it became part of his very skin. "And now?" she asked softly. "Now?" Tahu said, his voice rough as stone grinding against stone. "I walk where the wind calls me. I watch. I protect those who cannot protect themselves. It is not a life, it is penance." His gaze shifted toward the bound men who had tried to flee and betray him. They lay unconscious now, tied tighter with fresh rope. Their faces twitched in uneasy dreams, as if haunted by the spirit of the warrior who had broken them. The woman's thoughts spun. She looked at the ledger in her hands, its pages filled with records of stolen land, fraudulent deals, and cruel accounts of lives ruined. She realized then that this ledger was more than her father's shameful inheritance. It was a map of corruption, a testament to why men like Tahu's family had suffered. "Tahu," she said, her voice breaking. "This ledger, it's not just numbers and names. It's proof of everything men like them have taken. Maybe it can stop others from suffering like your family did." The warrior's eyes softened, though only slightly. He stepped closer, the firelight catching on the beads across his chest. "Or maybe it will draw more vultures to circle above you." She shook her head. "Then let them circle. Let them come. Because I won't run anymore. For the first time." Tahu regarded her not as someone fragile, not as someone needing saving, but as an equal standing at the edge of her own storm. The desert wind rose, carrying sparks from the fire into the starry sky. He saw in her a strength that echoed his own, a strength carved not by the absence of pain, but by the endurance of a dot. He lowered his spear and sat beside the fire once more. "Then tomorrow we ride, and together we will see where these names lead." The woman lowered herself opposite him, her face illuminated by the fire's glow. For the first time in years, Tahu felt something stir in his chest, something that wasn't rage or grief, but a fragile ember of purpose. The canyon was silent again, save for the low crackle of fire and the murmur of the stream. But within that silence, something had shifted. The warrior was no longer walking alone in penance, and the woman was no longer running from shadows. Together their paths had converged, and though the night still held danger, it also carried the promise of reckoning. The desert awoke with fire. Morning sunlight poured over the canyon walls, gold and fierce, as if the land itself demanded a reckoning. The woman, her dress torn and dusty, stood at the edge of camp with the ledger clutched to her chest. The warrior rose beside her, his long black hair catching the dawn, muscles coiled and ready like a drawn bow. His tribal beads and bone ornaments shimmered in the early light, whispering of strength and old traditions. The silence of dawn held a weight too still, too heavy. Like the breath before a storm doth, and it came, hoofbeats. The two men who had betrayed the night did not return alone. They came leading a posse of riders' grizzled faces, rifles gleaming in the sun, dust trailing behind their horses like smoke. 10 men, maybe 12, hardened by greed, their eyes fixed on the canyon, where truth had been hidden. The ground seemed to tremble beneath their charge. The woman's voice cracked. "They've brought more." The warrior did not flinch. His eyes narrowed, sharp as a hawk's, scanning the horizon. He stepped forward, bare chest glowing with the rising sun, spear gripped firm in his hand. He looked as if he had been carved from the desert itself, ancient and unyielding. "They come for power," he said, his deep voice steady. "But they do not know this land. The land chooses who walks it and who dies upon it." The posse thundered closer, rifles raised. The two men in the lead, the same men who had once stalked her, grinned cruelly, certain of their victory. "Hand it over, lady," one bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "The book and the gold it tells of, or we'll bury you both right here." The woman's hand shook, but she stood her ground. Dust swirled around her boots, her heart pounding so loud she swore the men could hear it. She glanced at the warrior, searching for courage. His calm, unbroken gaze met hers, and in it she found steel. "No," she whispered. Then louder, her voice ringing across the canyon. "No." The posse sneered and spurred their horses forward. The warrior moved like lightning. With a cry that split the morning, he hurled his spear. It flew straight and true, striking the ground before the horses' hooves, a warning. The sudden crack of stone and spark of fire startled the beasts, sending them rearing and whinnying in panic. Dust and chaos erupted as riders fought for control. Now. The warrior barked. He lunged into the fray, shirtless and unarmored. A storm of raw power and precision. His long black hair whipped like a banner of defiance as he wrenched a rider from his saddle, sending him crashing to the earth. A rifle cracked, the sound shattering the canyon stillness. The woman ducked behind a boulder, clutching the ledger as bullets sparked against stone. She dared a glance, saw the warrior weaving through the fight, using speed and knowledge of the land. He vanished into shadows, reappeared behind a rider, and dragged him from his horse. The canyon itself seemed to aid him. Falling rocks and blinding sun turned every step of the enemy into misfortune. The two men who had betrayed her dismounted, snarling. Their eyes burned with fury and desperation. One drew his revolver, pointing it straight at her. Her breath caught. Time slowed down, then the warrior was there between her and the gun. The shot rang out, the sound deafening. Dust exploded near his feet. He moved with impossible grace, disarming the man in one swift strike. The revolver clattered to the stones. Second man lunged with a knife, a wild slash aimed at the warrior's chest. But the warrior caught his wrist, twisting with brutal strength. The blade dropped. With a single decisive blow, he cast the man to the ground, beaten. The canyon fell. Silent. Horses pawed nervously. Men groaned in the dust, their pride broken more than their bones. The woman stepped out from behind the boulder, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. She looked at the warrior, who stood tall amid the fallen, chest heaving, hair wild in the morning sun. "It's over," she whispered. He shook his head slowly. "No, it has only begun." Her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" He gestured to the ledger in her arms. "That book is not just words. It is a chain linking your people and mine, binding them in greed and lies. If it remains, others will come. More men, stronger, hungrier." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing into her. "Then what do we do?" The warrior's eyes softened, though fire still smoldered there. we end the chain." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The sun climbed higher, painting the canyon in blazing gold. The woman slowly stepped forward, her hands trembling as she held out the ledger. Together, they walked to the campfire's remains. The warrior knelt, pulled a single coal from the ashes, and breathed life into it until flames sparked. He placed the book upon it. The fire caught quickly, pages curling and blackening, words of greed dissolving into smoke. The woman's tears welled, but they were not of sorrow, they were of release. The warrior stood beside her, a quiet sentinel. As flames consumed the past dot, as the last page turned to ash, he spoke softly. "Now, the land will remember only truth." The canyon wind rose, carrying the ashes into the sky, and with it, the promise of a new beginning.